Matt Walsh has done a number of videos addressing ADHD, usually ridiculing its existence. It's rare to come across a video where almost every sentence is misleading, unsupported, or factually incorrect. But that's exactly what we're dealing with here, a string of inane assertions that are only supported by Matt's lived experience. Let's break it down, claim by claim, and as always, we have the receipts. But first, who am I? I'm a parent whose son was diagnosed with ADHD and dyslexia in 2017. I'm an attorney that is offended by bad reasoning, bad arguments, and the total absence of evidence and logic. I have a master's degree in molecular biology, and I have read hundreds and hundreds of studies on ADHD. Based on those studies, I helped create Phoenix Health Science to develop nutritional supplements to support focus and mood. I've talked to hundreds of neurologists, pediatricians, and psychiatrists who use an integrative approach with their ADHD patients. And I've talked with hundreds of parents with children that have ADHD, autism, and dyslexia. Obviously, I have a bias, but I've disclosed my bias, and you will see that Matt has not so overtly disclosed his. One even wonders why Matt Walsh is so passionate about something he clearly has little understanding of. I have an idea why that might be. He touches on it towards the end. Always follow the money. But let's jump right into it.
That correlation doesn't equal causation, like it's some kind of scriptural edict. Here's some data that's worth considering. From 1980 to 2020, the share of male teachers in both elementary and middle schools declined from 40% to less than 20%. Men have mostly stopped teaching young children in school, and during this same period, as men have abandoned elementary schools, there's coincidentally been another major change in childhood education. Everyone's being diagnosed with ADHD.
So I've never heard that before. I've heard a lot of things. I've never heard that the decreased amount of men teachers in school has led to an increase of ADHD. But let's just check and see if his stats are right. He said that from 1980 to present, there used to be 40% male teachers, and now there's 20%. Well, if you come to the National Center for Education Statistics, it only goes back to 1987. But in 1987, there was a 70-30 split, 30% male, 70% female. It declines in the 90s, and in 2007, it's 24% for males, and in 2011 through present, so for the last 15 years, it's been about 23% male to female. The decline was in the 80s and 90s, and that is not the same period in which ADHD arose, but there was a decline in male teachers in the last 15 years.
More than 21% of 14-year-old boys in this country now supposedly suffer from this condition. The number goes up.
That's another thing that we can check. He said that 17% of boys and 21% of 14-year-old boys have ADHD, but if we go to the CDC, we can see that boys, 14%. So that's still a decent amount. It's not 17%, and for 14-year-olds, it's 17.9%. We'll give them 18%, which is not 21%. And one just makes you wonder, why add 3% to both? Like, why does that make a difference in his argument? But why report the facts incorrectly?
Up to 23% for 17-year-old boys. And as a result, prescriptions for drugs like Ritalin and Adderall have skyrocketed from 2012 to 2022. The total number of prescriptions for stimulants to treat ADHD increased dramatically.
So that's accurate. The amount of prescriptions for ADHD has increased, but let's see why it increased. So it was reported that a lot more adults are being diagnosed with ADHD, myself included. I was diagnosed after my son was diagnosed. So it is all too common that adults are being diagnosed more, but also the number of times reported in the stimulant medication shortage piece, what's driving the demand, and it is the increase of adults being diagnosed and women. Women are being diagnosed with ADHD more and more. If you are an adult or are a woman that has been diagnosed later in life with ADHD, let us know your story in the comments. This is a growing demographic. The number of ADHD patients is rising, especially in women. But what does Matt have to say next?
Nearly 60%. and boys between the ages of 10 to 14 were the demographic that saw the highest increase in these prescriptions.
So that is just patently false. He doesn't have any receipts, there's no citations, but he just made that up.
Now, for decades, you've been instructed to believe that there's no significance to this correlation whatsoever.
I don't think anyone was instructed to anything about this correlation or knew that this correlation existed. Nobody's certainly fighting the existence of this correlation.
As women increasingly entered the workforce and replaced men in teaching jobs, we're not supposed to draw any conclusions about how the behavior of male children is now being addressed. The truth, we've been told, is not that.
Sorry, that's just strange. I'm going to skip right ahead.
Not that schools have lost their capacity to educate male students. It's not that smartphone use and electronics in general have become distractions, which teachers have been unable to now being addressed. The truth, we've been told, is not that a feminized education system has increasingly punished normal male behavior that it doesn't understand. It's not that schools have lost their capacity to educate male students. It's not that smartphone use and electronics in general have become distractions, which teachers have been unable to control.
So I've heard that. I think we've all heard smartphones, video games, screens have been distractions. And we hear people say that that causes ADHD, but I've never heard this male teacher theory.
Instead, we've been led to believe that, in truth, boys have suddenly become afflicted with a severe and mysterious psychological disorder. There's no objective biologically based test for this disorder.
So that is another thing that's not hard to Google if you have that. Oh, I missed this receipt. So yeah, there were a couple other articles. Parents having ADHD. This one talks about how actually the percentage of males with prescription fills decreased from 2016 to 2020 for males younger than 19 years. So it actually went down.
There's no objective biologically based test for this disorder.
So that would be another incorrect statement. There are objective tests. So TOVA is a medical device that objectively helps with the assessment and diagnosis. Well, it helps with the assessment and evaluation so that a medical practitioner can diagnose for ADHD. There's also QB-Tech, which is also a medical device that helps with the diagnosis of ADHD. I've actually spoken to the reps for both of these. They're great. One of the reps at QB-Tech was explaining how it is actually more accurate and provides a more accurate diagnosis than sitting down with a psychologist and doing one of the parent-teacher rating scale systems for diagnosis, because it uses objective measurements. And I don't have a dog in this fight. I think both TOVA and QB-Tech do both the same thing. But it also helps you determine whether it's ADHD or maybe it's depression, maybe it's anxiety. And people are often told they don't have it after going to see a doctor. Matt acts like you go into a doctor and you say, I think I have ADHD, and the doctor's like, of course you do. No, people are told all the time you don't have ADHD. This one I found was really interesting. This is recent. This was April. AI identifies ADHD with high accuracy through retinal imaging study. That's the first time I've ever taught that, or have seen that. But Matt is just not correct in saying there is no objective test or measure for ADHD.
Can anyone point to a specific gene or pathogen that might cause it?
And no one would refer to a specific gene because that's not how genetics work.
The scientific consensus for many years now has nevertheless been clear. ADHD, they've said again and again, is real. And the way to treat it is to give children speed in the form of drugs like Ritalin.
Nobody ever said this. And speed is not Ritalin. There's a difference between methylphenidate and amphetamines, probably over your pay grade.
Now, as I've said repeatedly all this time for well over a decade, the science behind the theory of ADHD isn't simply underbaked or inadequate. It is comically useless to the point that it is obviously. The scientific consensus for many years now has nevertheless been clear. ADHD, they've said again and again, is real. And the way to treat it is to give children speed in the form of drugs like Ritalin.
Nobody has ever said that. If you have to characterize something, mischaracterize something, if you have to set up a straw man, that's a red flag that you're making something up and you don't have a basis for your actual perspective.
Now, as I've said repeatedly all this time for well over a decade, the science behind the theory of ADHD isn't simply underbaked or inadequate. It is comically useless to the point that it is obviously fraudulent.
So I'm really curious how he comes up with this. All of the science. Matt just knows that all of the science is just totally made up. He doesn't seem to be aware that there are also non-stimulant medications for ADHD treatment, and not all people that are diagnosed with ADHD get any kind of medication. He seems to think that everyone just goes off and gets speed, as you would say. I'm curious how he's decided to speak on behalf of the entire scientific community for all of the science, that it is all a fraud. And obviously, this is just kind of a quick snapshot into the research that's been done on ADHD. But I asked ChatGTP the total number of studies on ADHD, and it is estimating around 50,000. I don't know if that's accurate or not. It could be, but it's a lot. It could be, double that. It could be half that. That's a lot of studies. I don't think Matt has gone through 5 of those to form an opinion. What is the breakdown between commercial funding of this research and academic? And I was a little surprised to find out that only 20 to 30% are industry funded studies. The rest is academic or government studies. And again, that could be wrong. That this is ChatGTP. The point is, there's a significant amount of non-commercial funding into research. But then what does the research consist of? 30 to 40% is focused on the biological and neurological mechanisms, the science, if you will, of ADHD, and then 60 to 70% is focused on the treatment of ADHD. So he really keeps hitting down on, he does not like that people use stimulant medication, but a lot of the research has nothing to do with stimulant medication. It has to do with other treatments, and it's just what is going on in the brain of someone that is said to have ADHD. Of the studies that deal with treatment, about 70 to 80% has to do with stimulant and non-stimulant. That's not really a surprise that the majority makes up that. But then there's also nutritional interventions, omega-3s, nutrients, macronutrients, elimination diets. 5 to 10% of the studies are on those. And then there's 10 to 15% of the studies on sleep, medication timing. In total, there's a significant amount of research on ADHD, and it seems that Matt is saying all of this is fraudulent, and that seems unlikely.
The whole thing is a fraud. The researchers showed a child 2 separate videos. One of the videos was about mathematics, and it involved a teacher talking about basic addition, subtraction, and multiplication. The other video was the pod racing scene from Star Wars. And as you can see from the videos, the child became bored during the math lecture. He starts spinning in his chair and fidgeting. On the other hand, when the child is shown something more engaging, he suddenly stops fidgeting. He's actually paying attention.
So there's a lot of fodder here, but this is not evidence of fraud. This is a video you can make fun of for ADHD studies, but it is one study among 50,000.
The Star Wars, he was not paying attention to the math video.
And it certainly is not evidence of fraud.
Now, unless you're an alien who's never interacted with a child and was never a child yourself, there is nothing remotely interesting or surprising about this footage. It's exactly what you would expect a normal, healthy child to do. In the academic world, which exists to sell pharmaceuticals to children, this was a groundbreaking experiment.
I don't think that that's what the purpose of the academic world is. I wish, if it were, I wish when I went to get my master's degree at Georgia Tech, they would have told me that. That's news to me. But it wasn't a groundbreaking study in the academic world either. It was a dissertation paper of a PhD student. And as research goes, it got published. But it wasn't like some big study that was the core basis of our understanding of ADHD. It was the dissertation paper of a PhD student. Congratulations, Matt. You beat up a PhD student.
Footage was the basis for a peer-reviewed article in something called the Journal of Abnormal Child Psychology. Abnormal Child Psychology. And the University of Central Florida bragged about their findings with this headline: ADHD kids can be still if they're not straining their brains.
I don't know that they much bragged. They didn't say that as the title of the article, but they published You know, they had a student that got a dissertation published in a scientific journal article. Why wouldn't you put that in the college newspaper?
Their conclusion was that ADHD is a nefarious disorder that's only triggered by cognitively demanding tasks, and that we need to be vigilant of ADHD whenever children have to use their brains in specific ways.
That's exactly what they said. Thank you. Thank you for the excellent
Now,
summary.
In reality, of course, the University of Central Florida had simply discovered the concept that is known as boredom. That's all they accomplished. The kid was bored of the math video because a math video is boring.
Again, I don't think that if this were true, if this were accurate, you wouldn't need to mischaracterize the headline. But what I'm curious about, Matt, is what about dyslexia? What do you think about dyslexia? Is that a fraud too? Is this a scam that children have concocted to get out of reading? I mean, seriously, they have eyes, they can see. I've seen them read. They can do it. They're just not trying hard enough. Or is dyslexia real? Is it a brain-based difficulty in decoding written language due to impaired phonological processing, disrupted letter sounding mapping, or is it just a scam because kids don't want to read anymore?
Now multiply this garbage study by about 10 million and you get the sum and substance of ADHD research over the past few decades.
Again, if you do another ADHD video, Matt, please describe who's going through all this on your staff. Are you reading all this? What is the basis to say that this is a garbage study and that is what the entire research consists of? Because there's over 50,000 studies.
None of it is legitimate.
None of it.
It is all nonsense. And as a result, we've all been waiting for the moment when, at long last, the medical establishment and mainstream media will finally acknowledge that none of this science is legitimate, because when that happens, millions of children will be spared these damaging and grossly unnecessary ADHD drugs. And this week, belatedly, that moment has...
I would like to know who's making this claim, because there are no receipts. There's no citations for any of these conclusions. The only receipt we have is Matt's lived experience. He just can't understand, he just can't process that someone has a disorder of regulating their attention. If you have a loved one or know someone with ADHD that has to deal with this type of grandiose ignorance, if Matt's rhetorical... if his rhetoric strengthens a stigma that's harmed you, let us know, because I think it would be really good for him to know how hard it is to get by with this stigma. Because let's just assume let's assume ADHD is real and it takes you a little bit harder to focus and concentrate. In school, if you have a disorder, you can get an IEP and you can have special conditions set that help you with studying and taking testing. And forgetting medication aside, if someone does have a hard time switching gears and getting started, would you be opposed to 5 minutes extra for being able to take a timed test if someone, needed that time? That stigma, it's really hard for people to get the education that they need even without medication, even if your paradigm is true. So again, if you've been harmed by the stigma, let us know, because that is actually the reason why the New York Times article was written.
The New York Times Magazine has just published a very lengthy article entitled, quote, "Have we been thinking about ADHD all wrong?"
So, as an initial matter, I find it comical that he's talking to his audience about how important this New York Times article is. And if you know anything about Matt Walsh, he has not always treated the New York Times as a source of credible journalism.
Now, it's important to note at the outset that this article is not the result of some new discovery in the field of ADHD. There has not been any new groundbreaking research. Instead, the piece is a collection of existing studies about ADHD. Some of them are dating back more than a decade, along with testimony from researchers who in the past were some of the leading voices promoting ADHD medications.
So he's right. The New York Times article is not a new study. It's not a study. It is not reporting on a new study. It is taking a perspective of looking at many studies, not all of the studies, but many studies historically. And the title is really indicative of what it's about. Have we been thinking about ADHD all wrong? But Matt's title is, "The experts are finally admitting that ADHD is a scam." Those two do not mean the same thing.
And now these researchers would like you to know that they've changed their minds, because after thinking about things for a while, they've realized that they were completely wrong.
So it doesn't say that at all. One of the studies that he's referring to is this study by the MTA Cooperative Group, and James Swanson is the person quoted in the New York Times article. It would be interesting if he actually had any citations. None of the researchers went back on the findings that they made.
Oops, sorry about that. You all have your kids on speed for no reason. Our bad.
The article doesn't say that clearly.
Now, the article opens by discussing a researcher named James Swanson, who conducted a famous experiment in the 1990s that tracked three groups of students over a long period of time. One group of students received drugs for their alleged ADHD. Another group received behavioral training, and then a third group didn't receive any kind of treatment at all. After a little over a year, the study supposedly showed that the kids who received Ritalin.
So I'm not going to go into the science of what the New York Times article discussed or what studies it referred to in this video. The purpose of this video is just to show the easy, demonstrably false points that Matt Walsh makes, because there's so many of them. And then also, as kind of the broader, why was this New York Times article written and what was the purpose behind that?
Were doing a lot better than any other group. And this study immediately became a major national news story. It was sold as proof that Ritalin works and that ADHD is real. Researchers like...
So, I mean, it was a big study, but I don't know that it was a national treasure. This is one of the later studies. This was kind of the update in 2022. It was a large ongoing study. But yeah, James Swanson was a part of it. Many other individuals. I actually know and have talked to Eugene Arnold, who is a great individual, a very good person. And this article is transparent. At the very end, it talks about how many of them have received money from pharmaceutical companies. All the disclosures are here. The government grants are here. There's nothing out of the ordinary here.
Like Swanson became highly paid consultants for the pharmaceutical industry, shilling ADHD drugs. So, you know, everybody was happy. At least everybody who's making money off of this thing.
Okay, so everybody that's making money off of this thing, you really should be a little bit more careful when you say stuff like that, and especially if you're not going to disclose everything that you're up to. So one of today's sponsors is Qualia Life Science. Well, what does Qualia Life Science sell? Oh, they sell a dietary supplement that is for focus, memory, and drive, the ultimate brain health food. I actually like looking and evaluating dietary supplements because most are just not good. They use bad ingredients or just not bioavailable ingredients. And so I took a look at this because I was curious, and it's actually, I hate to say it, it's actually a pretty good product. It has all the B vitamins. A lot of B complexes will only have like folate, B6, B12. This has almost the whole concert of B vitamins. It's got the active forms that cross the blood-brain barrier. Lion's mane has lately been shown to help with BDNF. Phosphatidylserine I take issue with because it comes from sunflower, so it doesn't have the omegas and it's probably not doing anything. But acetylcholine is a really great ingredient, and if you do feel a little bit more alert by taking it, it's probably the caffeine. The ingredients are solid here. I want to not like it. In fact, I did actually like it, like the company so much that I checked out their Senolytic, or their Senolytic, which is a supplement for aging or getting rid of senescent cells. I'd never seen anything like that, so I wanted to give that a try because I am getting older. So I take no issue with Qualia. Great, good product. They're a little more expensive. They're expensive. But I'm just curious because, you know, the devil's in the details. So I pulled out my Jungle Scout app, which is a tool used for Amazon, and seeing what keywords are used for Amazon. And sure enough, Qualia, their neurohacker collective, they are using keywords with ADHD. ADHD supplement for adults, ADHD supplements for adults, ADHD natural treatment, best supplements for ADHD, best vitamins for ADHD. They're going after a lot of ADHD terms, which I take no issue with. They should do that. That's part of the game. But for Matt Walsh to receive money as a sponsor from a company that profits off the existence of ADHD while he denies the existence of ADHD, That just seems not as transparent or honest as one would expect when someone is trying to take the moral, righteous high ground.
And that is, in spite of the fact that even if the drugs really did improve a child's behavior or academic
So he
performance.
goes off on some baseball analogy with steroids. I'm going to deconstruct that flawed analogy in part two. But like I said earlier, if you've ever been challenged on the existence of ADHD and you've heard some of these really bad arguments that Matt has made and want to respond with facts, what I would suggest is that you pause the video. And if you see, you go down here where it says save, and you can save to a bookmark. And you can save this video to come back later and get all of the receipts in part two, so that if you want to get more facts behind these positions, because you have to deal with this kind of nonsense.
So in other words, now that he's 80, this researcher who played a vital role in the mass prescribing of ADHD drugs has no problem going on the record and explaining that the so-called science on ADHD is essentially meaningless.
So he didn't say that. I mean, this video is kind of boring, I guess, because I play something that Matt says and then I just say he didn't say that. And it's really hard to disprove a negative. The only way you can disprove a negative is to try and find the existence of it. So, ask ChatGTP, did James Swanson or anyone else associated with those studies disavow or retract their conclusions on ADHD? There's no credible evidence in academic journals, professional interviews, or public statements that James Swanson has formally recanted or disavowed any of his ADHD work on the multimodal treatment study, and none of the other people associated with the study have detracted or retracted their statements. And just so you get kind of the idea of the research, the state of research of the science, I asked ChatGPT to come up with the top 30 researchers by the amount of publications and how many times they've been cited, and kind of weigh them in that regard. And he does come up. So James Swanson is 28, and I've done this in ChatGPT a couple of times. He's come up higher, like in 12. But this is generally the top 30 scientists that have publications on ADHD. And then you ask ChatGPT, have any of these top 30 researchers retracted or publicly stated that ADHD is not a real condition? And it is no, none of them. They continue their advocacy and publication on ADHD science. None of the researchers have declared that ADHD is not a real disorder, have publicly retracted or recanted their findings on ADHD. And so for him to say that experts are finally admitting that ADHD is a scam is just an abject lie.
Reality sets in. The quote-unquote top scientists are all admitting this now. It's not just James Swanson who's recanting his old research on ADHD. For example, in 2017, a Dutch neuroscientist named Martine Hoogman announced that she had...
Dr. Hoogman is referenced in the New York Times study. Again, I'm going to address her statements on the scientific findings that she had in the next one. But I'm going to give you just a little bit of a teaser for what that's about.
Okay, so here we have a leading expert who claimed in 2017 that her research proved that ADHD alters the brains. And now, via an email with a New York Times reporter, she casually admits that her...
Doesn't that seem odd to you? That's not how things... that's not how things work, right? That scientists don't retract their scientific studies and their publications involving dozens of other entities through an email, through a New York Times reporter. Like, why would you put so much weight on something so bizarre?
Research showed that the brains of people who are diagnosed with ADHD and the brains of everybody else are almost identical.
So here's the teaser for part two. Imagine Nashville. Think of Nashville. Think of the roads. Think of the buildings. Think of all the infrastructure. And then think of the traffic. Now, imagine an alternative universe. And in this universe, there are no traffic lights. There are no stop signs. All of the roads, the cars, and the people are exactly the same. Now imagine another alternative universe. Here, the traffic lights all run by AI. All cars have GPS, and they're all tapped into the system. In all three scenarios, the roads, the cars are exactly the same. The structure, of the city is exactly the same. Is the traffic the same?
Now, to call this a walk back would be a massive understatement. These people are completely abandoning everything they've been saying with absolute certainty for years now. To be clear, it wasn't just this one scientist. Dozens of leading experts pushed the idea that ADHD is a symptom of observable physical issues in the brain. They even published a consensus statement claiming that a single gene caused ADHD.
That sounded very strange to me. Sometimes when you know a thing, you know when someone doesn't know a thing, and no scientist I could ever think of would claim that a neurological condition is attributable to one gene. So because that sounded so strange, I had to do my own research into the matter. This was one of the studies that he's referring to. Dr. Hugman, who was referenced in the New York Times article, this is a lot of the research. And this was published in 2017, and it talks about differences in brains between people with ADHD and people without ADHD. And since 2017, there have been no corrections made. There have been no retractions. This consortium, he mentioned that there was a consensus paper saying that, there was a single gene responsible for ADHD, and back nobody ever said that. Nobody would have ever said that. Is there a biological basis for it? Yes, and that research has expanded, and that's what this Times article talks about in trying to destigmatize ADHD and let parents know it's not their parenting necessarily. But their brains are different. People with ADHD showed slower development in 5 brain regions. This article also talks about the differences in structure, function, and chemistry of the brain. Just a couple of things if ADHD is not real. So you've missed a couple of points. People with ADHD are especially prone to rejection sensitivity dysphoria. This is when people experience severe emotional pain from being rejected. So people who have ADHD are often stigmatized, but they feel that rejection even more. If ADHD is not a thing, why does this class of people tend to experience this more than other people? But also the plus side. You've completely ignored how a lot of people now, because of that stigma, kind of phrase the narrative to say that people with ADHD have superpowers, because people with ADHD often have higher creativity. They are more spontaneous and enjoying and being goal-driven and passionate in the moment. There are cognitive advantages of ADHD that's oftentimes associated with higher intelligence. Many entrepreneurs that are creative have ADHD, and they're a little bit more flexible in their thinking instead of being so rigid. There's also a whole emotional component to ADHD that has nothing really to do with the cognitive aspects. They are risk takers, optimistic, imaginative, hyper-focused. Why is it that people that are diagnosed with ADHD often have these types of traits as well, if ADHD is not a thing? Some of the things that are associated with ADHD, like the rejection sensitivity dysphoria, is emotional dysregulation, impulsivity, low frustration tolerance, sensitivity to criticism, sleep dysregulation, time blindness. That's a big one. If you find anyone that has time blindness, odds are they have ADHD. But also, ADHD is really poorly named because people can have attention and can focus and can hyper focus and focus on something and be so driven to the task that they work on it for 12 straight hours and forget to eat. It is a failure to regulate attention.
So yes, we have drastically increased the risk of permanently destroying children's brains and bodies. We have given them drugs that are stunting their growth permanently, based entirely on junk science. And that's just what the New York Times is willing to admit right now.
This is just still funny. It's the New York Times' fault. They won't tell you what's already been published out there. He knows his audience. He knows his audience doesn't like the New York Times, and he's going to bring them in on the conspiracy. But the data's available to everybody. Why would they hold it back if there were a story there?
Give them another 20 years, and they'll tell you all about the effects that amphetamines have on the heart as well. And All of this data, of course.
So why don't you report on it? It seems like there's so much fodder. You could really be a paradigm changer here.
Like, it's all out there. They're just refusing to tell you about it. Now, everyone, whether they have children or not, intuitively understands that children go through phases. We don't need to administer psychoactive drugs every time they go through a phase we don't like. And we all know that it didn't really take decades for leading scientific experts to come to this conclusion. They knew it all along, but they had a financial incentive to say otherwise. Only now that the situation has devolved into total absurdity, now that we're supposed to pretend that 25% of teenagers suffer from this diagnosis.
It's gone up in the last 20 minutes. It's gone from 21% to 25%. We must have lost another 10% of male teachers.
Are some of these experts finally telling the truth? And they're also finally admitting that, in reality, the cure for ADHD is simply doing things that are interesting.
So why was the New York Times article written? What was the point behind that when all this data is essentially pretty old? Did you know how prevalent ADHD is in children that are born with fetal alcohol syndrome? So my parents adopted 2 children from Russia 30 years ago, and they were both born with fetal alcohol syndrome. And my brother Nikolai could not function without Ritalin. That's when I first heard of what Ritalin is, was in the 90s. Because he could not function without it. I hope if anyone has ever met Nikolai, they would know he has to have medication. So I think that there is some space, hopefully, where that type of medication is necessary in people that are definitely fetal alcohol syndrome and maybe some other special case situations. And now there's this perspective that in the digital age and in this era where education has changed historically, that ADHD might be more on a spectrum, and maybe there are alternatives to medication. So that's what the Times article was talking about. Does someone have it black or white? Sometimes yes. Does someone have it spectrum? Sometimes yes. I think one of the things we need to do is separate what you have conflated. ADHD isn't real, so don't give them medication. ADHD is real, and sometimes it's necessary to medicate them, and sometimes it's not. And what I think most people are forgetting, and what I think most people don't consider, but a lot do, is that it's not a dichotomy of either or. If you take medication, don't neglect sleep, don't neglect nutrition, don't neglect exercise. Take it as an all-encompassing thing. This is a complex, nuanced issue that millions of people have to address every single day. And your viewers deserve better than such an uneducated, unsubstantiated, unthoughtful rant. This is a problem. In the space of 16 minutes, ADHD went up, in your view, another 2 to 3%. And not just in 14-year-old boys, but in everyone. It does really seem like there's something more with your passionate about ADHD. In fact, I would say, Matt, say you have ADHD without saying you have ADHD.
Long time ago. You know, as I've mentioned plenty of times, I have gone through this myself. I was a terrible student in school. I could have easily been diagnosed with ADHD if my parents wanted to go that route.
With all the reading that you say you've done, I would challenge you to read something that challenges your understanding. Read something that contradicts your paradigm instead of just substantiates your confirmation bias. Try to understand this a little bit more.
Thankfully, they didn't. But even though I couldn't complete a school assignment to save my life, now as an adult, I write the word count equivalent of like 2 or 3 chapters of a book every single week while preparing for this show. I also read all the time. I enjoy learning new things. I didn't when I was in school. What changed? What accounts for the change? Did my ADHD wear off?
Did it again. In Matt's video, there's no evidence that the experts are finally admitting that ADHD is a scam. This is clickbait. Scam requires fraudulent intent, nor is there evidence that there's a scientific consensus that has undergone a radical 180 as of late. What Matt's thesis is that there is no ADHD, so don't medicate your kids. And the first mistake is combining these 2 separate ideas into one. ADHD exists. Medication is one method among many in managing inattention and hyperactivity. And I'm probably the most unlikely person to be commenting on a video like this. When my son was diagnosed with ADHD, we wanted to avoid medication. In 2017, there weren't a lot of supplements like there are now. There was basically Focus Factor, and that had a whole bunch of non-bioavailable vitamins. So we created Accentrate. It is in my financial interest to agree with Matt, but I can't because the data doesn't support it. I've talked to hundreds of doctors about Accentrate. I was in Fort Worth with a doctor, and he said, I like recommending nutrients, especially omega-3 fatty acids, because I like it when my patients are getting support 24/7. I like it when they get support when they're sleeping. Medication wears off. But I also recommend stimulants early and aggressively. And that kind of shocked me. He was like, if a child is diagnosed with ADHD at 5 years old, 6, 7, 8, I will immediately start recommending stimulant medication. This is not my view. This is not Phoenix's view. I'm just reporting what one pediatrician in Fort Worth, Texas told me in 2019. And what he said is that there's data and there's a ton of studies that show that when ADHD is treated early and aggressively, that it stimulates the growth of neurons and the brain develops, that a lot of what ADHD is an underdeveloped brain. And he said that in his practice, he found that if he did that, he would only need to recommend stimulant medication for a few years, and then they would essentially grow out of their ADHD. And I am not advocating that. That is not my perspective. I am just saying that because I heard that, I had to evaluate that for my son. And we did decide to get him on 5 milligrams of methylphenidate only on school days. And that's not even how you're supposed to do it if you follow what the doctors say. But we were concerned about this his freshman and sophomore year in high school and stayed with, sleep habits and nutrition and good food. And his junior year of high school, he told me he didn't think he needed the medication anymore. So we didn't get it. And his junior year and senior year in high school, he had no medication. And at his IEP in March of 2024, when he was a junior, all of his teachers said he had no issue with attention. So I'm going to throw one idea out, since you like steroid metaphors. What if, you know that if you are taking steroids for bodybuilding and putting on muscle, if you don't also work out and go to the gym and have protein, that taking steroids alone you're not going to bulk up. But if you take steroids and you take protein and you work out, then you're giving your body what it needs to put on the muscle. Well, what if you're taking stimulant medication, but you're not giving the neurons what it needs to grow? So what if a low-dose stimulant with an omega-3, whether it's fish, a supplement, fish oil, whatever, it doesn't matter, but give the brain the literal building blocks that it needs to grow? That is just my hypothesis. I am not giving any medical advice or making any scientific claims, but it kind of makes sense.
One thing, complicated, but the medics treated it as if it's complicated for decades. This whole thing has obviously become something of a pattern in the field of modern medicine. In the last few years, we've learned, or at least those of us who hadn't been paying close attention learned, that the chemical imbalance theory of depression was a lie. Gender affirming care was a lie. The claims about how lockdowns wouldn't hurt children was a lie. And now ADHD is a lie.
Well, I will say 3 out of 4 ain't bad. But I would also say, did Isaac Newton scam the world into Newtonian physics as a ploy to sell more apples? Or do the models evolve as data increases? Science will always be changing. So you mentioned lockdowns, and that brings up a very interesting aspect with mental health. In 2014, I was involved in some litigation. I was an attorney representing a generic company regarding a medical food that was used to manage depression. The brand was Deplin. It contained L-methylfolate, which is the bioavailable form of folate that crosses the blood-brain barrier and has been shown to be helpful with people with depression. I deposed the expert, and after about 4 hours of going through the case, I was just curious scientifically because I had a roommate in college that had clinical depression. And it seemed so sad to me that his brain just didn't work and he could never feel happy. So I just started asking him questions about depression and whether it was genetic or whether it was environment. And like most things, it's a mixture of both. And one of the things that he said was people could go their whole lives and maybe have a genetic predisposition to depression, but not be clinically depressed their whole life. But then an environmental factor happens, either a disease, cancer, or some major stress or trauma, and then that causes epigenetic changes in gene expression for serotonin or other neurotransmitters affecting mood. And you could later develop clinical depression. And I thought that was just fascinating, that there is a genetic component, but the environment can play a big factor. So I don't think that it's fair to say that the SSRIs were all lies. It's probably fairer to say that clinicians were trying their best with the information that they have. And I know you get more viewers if you say it's a lie or it's a scam or it's a fraud, but you could just say it was an incorrect understanding or there's a better understanding or here's an update.
They are lying about everything. They are constantly lying. And these are not lies of little consequence. Millions of people, especially children, have been hurt, often permanently. The only winner in this process, as always, has been the pharmaceutical industry, which has convinced millions of parents to buy their drugs and medicalize a completely normal aspect of the human condition.
The only winner is not the pharmaceutical industry. You've left out a major important group, the drug dealers. I mean, if you're going to go on with this narrative, why leave the drug dealers out? I think it's very disingenuous to say that these medical practitioners, neurologists, pediatricians, psychiatrists, dietitians, chiropractors, that they all just want the copay and that they aren't sincerely trying to help their patients. I think it's hubris to say that you know more than these thousands of people that have spent thousands of hours with hundreds of actual people. The only winner? Careful. If you are going to take income from a sponsor that seems to compete against your villain, can you really say that you have no financial interest here? Matt, you're wrong on the science. However, I don't think that you're wrong to be concerned. I think that we actually would agree on a lot if you would just listen and study a little bit more. The increase in ADHD has nothing to do with male teachers in school. I'm going to pretend you never said that, but the increase in diagnosis is increasing. And if it's nature versus nurture, nature in our environment has changed radically in the last 30 years. And ADHD isn't the only mental health condition that's on the rise. Almost all mental health conditions are increasing. So what's going on? I hosted a podcast with Dr. Gabriel, who's a pediatrician in Brooklyn, and he reports increases in ADHD, autism, anxiety, especially since the lockdown, and talks about what has changed in the environment in the last 30 years. Diets have changed, behaviors changed, exercise has changed, and the amount of toxins in the environment and in our food and our exposure to harmful chemicals has changed. So if we want to do something constructive, then Matt, I would invite you to read some. And we have 3 more parts on this, responding to all of Matt Walsh's ADHD commentary. We haven't filmed the 4th one yet, so if there's any issue that you want us to address, let us know and we'll try and respond in part 4.